May 3, 1945. The war in Europe is in its final death throes, but in the Austrian Alps, a different battle brews, one that would defy all expectations. Captain Jack Lee, a seasoned American tank commander with the 12th Armored Division, receives a secret and urgent mission unlike any before. Intelligence reports reveal that Castle Itter, a centuries-old fortress perched on a remote hilltop, holds some of France's most important political prisoners, 2 former prime ministers, celebrated war heroes, and high-ranking officials critical to the future of Europe. However, the castle is guarded not by Americans, but by a small group of German Wehrmacht soldiers, resolute and defiant. These men face an impossible choice: stay loyal to a collapsing regime or protect innocent lives from the merciless SS squads descending on the castle to execute their prisoners. Jack doesn't hesitate. With a skeleton crew of just 14 soldiers and a battered Sherman tank, he prepares to push into enemy territory, hoping to reach the castle before it becomes a tomb. The mission is fraught with danger. 30 kilometers of rugged terrain, enemy patrols at every turn, and the racial and ideological hatred that has defined this brutal war. Inside the castle walls, the prisoners tremble in their cramped quarters, unaware that salvation approaches, but uncertain whom to trust. The atmosphere is thick with fear, tension, and fragile hope. The stories of each man weave a complex tapestry of courage and betrayal, a reflection of the fractured world outside. Meanwhile, the German soldiers preparing the defense share uneasy glances. They are outnumbered and outgunned, but they will fight as fiercely as any for their own reasons: honor, redemption, or desperate survival. As Jack's convoy pushes forward, the first skirmishes begin, a harrowing taste of what lies ahead. Every step forward forces him to confront not only the enemy, but his own beliefs about courage, loyalty, and what it means to be a hero. The night sky darkens, but the fire of determination burns brighter. This is no ordinary battle. This is a fight for the soul of humanity amidst chaos. The morning fog clung to the shattered landscape as Captain Jack Lee and his small convoy of 14 men embarked on their perilous journey toward Castle Itter. Every inch forward was a battle in itself. The 30 kilometers ahead were no ordinary terrain: twisted roads riddled with craters, broken trees scarred by shell fire, and abandoned villages shattered by war. Enemy patrols scoured the area, desperate to catch any American forces nearing their prize. Jack's men moved cautiously, knowing that a single mistake could mean death or capture. The road was silent, save for the crunch of gravel under the Sherman tank's tracks and whispers of hushed orders. Tension was palpable. They were deep in a no-man's land, surrounded by enemies who viewed them as invaders and deserters alike. Jack's thoughts drifted to the mission's impossible odds. How could a tiny force breach the defenses of a fortress surrounded by loyal German soldiers and fanatical SS units? Yet failure was not an option, not when lives hung by the thinnest thread at the castle's gates. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle shattered the silence. A bullet zipped past one soldier's ear, sending a jolt of adrenaline through the group. Instinct took over. The convoy sprung into action, barrels raised and eyes scanning the tree line for the hidden enemy. A fierce exchange erupted. The Sherman's cannon barked, taking out an enemy lookout perched high in a ruined watchtower. The Americans pressed on, but the threat was unrelenting. Mines and booby traps slowed their advance. Several men narrowly escaped fatal wounds, their souls tested against the grim realities of war. As they navigated a narrow mountain pass, an ambush awaited. Hidden SS troops sprang from the rocks, firing with deadly precision. The convoy was pinned down, caught in a deadly crossfire. Panic flickered, but discipline held. Jack orchestrated a daring maneuver. Using the Sherman's firepower as a shield, his men formed a protective perimeter while returning controlled volleys. The battle crawled agonizingly forward, moment by moment. Private Daniels, a young rifleman, took a bullet in the leg but refused evacuation, clutching his wound as he fired relentlessly. The spirit among the soldiers burned fiercely, each man aware that retreat was a death sentence for the prisoners awaiting them. Hours seemed like days. Exhausted and bloodied, the convoy finally broke through the ambush and reached the outskirts of Castle Itter's shadow. The ancient fortress stood defiant against a blood-red sunset, its walls promising sanctuary or doom. Jack's radio crackled faintly. No reinforcements had arrived, no backup was coming. The mission was theirs alone, balanced on razor's edge, every muscle tensed in anticipation. The impossible journey was almost over. But what awaited inside the stone walls was beyond anything they could imagine. The first rays of dawn spilled over the rugged Alps as Captain Jack Lee and his weary convoy reached the majestic yet foreboding silhouette of Castle Itter. The castle's ancient stone walls, scarred by the horrors of war, stood silent sentinel over the tense meeting soon to unfold. Approaching the gate cautiously, Jack's party was met not by friendly faces, but by a contingent of German Wehrmacht soldiers. At their head stood Major Josef Gangl, a man torn between duty and conscience. His gaze was sharp, eyes narrowed with suspicion, and hardened by years entrenched in a war that had long ceased to make sense. Their uniforms marked them as enemies, their weapons ready. Yet in this moment, the line between foe and friend blurred. Tense words were exchanged, voices low and wary. Jack's mission was laid bare, to join forces to protect the French prisoners within the castle from the fanatical SS forces closing in. Major Gangel's response was measured. He revealed his own doubts and growing defiance of orders that only sought destruction. Minutes stretched into hours as the two reluctant leaders struggled to build trust. Every look, every gesture was scrutinized under the weight of centuries of conflict and the terrifying immediacy of a shared enemy. Inside the castle, the prisoners, men of great stature and fragile hope, watched anxiously as their liberators and guards stood side by side, preparing for a battle unlike any other. Jack and Joseph walked the ramparts together, deliberate undercurrents of mutual respect growing even as they both prepared for the worst. The impossible alliance was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Later, as preparations for defense heightened, stories emerged. A young American whose laughter never faded despite the war, a Wehrmacht soldier questioning all he believed, and the legacy of the prisoners waiting for freedom that might never come. The castle became a microcosm of the war's final days. Fear, courage, betrayal, and hope mingled in every shadowed corner. In the silence before the storm, Jack and Joseph made a silent pact to fight as one or die trying. The walls of Castle Itter, ancient and towering, stood as a solemn witness to the uneasy calm that settled over the fortress as the defenders prepared for the inevitable storm. Inside, tension hung thick in the air, heavier than the stone that held them together. Captain Jack Lee walked the narrow corridors, his footsteps echoing a cautious rhythm, thinking ahead to the battle they all knew was coming. Soldiers and prisoners alike worked feverishly. Barricades were reinforced, weapons checked and loaded, and plans whispered in dimly lit rooms. The French prisoners, once men of power and influence, were forced into new roles as improvised defenders. Fear cracked their stoic exteriors, but beneath it lay a fierce determination to survive. Among them was a former tennis champion whose unexpected bravery would soon become legendary. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of responsibility, to protect not just himself, but everyone around him. German soldiers, once sworn enemies of the Americans, now stood at their sides, equal parts wary and resolute. Major Joseph Gangl gathered his men, emphasizing the singular goal, to hold the castle at all costs. He shared stories that hinted at the humanity torn between duty to a regime and the call of conscience. Some whispered of secret resistance within the Wehrmacht, men like Gangl who chose to do what was right above what was commanded. As night deepened, the defenders shared scarce moments of quiet. Grueling conversations mingled with shared meals and quiet prayers. Bonds began to form across old divides, the lines between enemy and ally fading in the flickering candlelight. Outside, shadows lengthened as SS troops tightened their encirclement, their snarls a constant reminder of the brutality waiting beyond the walls. Scouts brought back grim news of reinforcements yet to arrive, and every passing hour edged Castle Itter closer to a desperate stand. Jack felt the burden of command heavier than ever. He sought out the prisoners to reassure them, not with empty promises, but with the steely truth. They would fight and they would endure, together. In those final hours before the storm, the castle was a fragile island of hope, standing defiantly against the coming darkness. Each defender braced for the fight of their lives, knowing that tomorrow would test their courage and their humanity in ways none could foresee. Dawn broke over Castle Itter, a bleak gray light illuminating the battered fortress, standing resiliently amidst a landscape scarred by relentless war. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of dread, hope, and fierce resolve. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, prepared for the final assault that could come at any moment. Captain Jack Lee crouched behind a makeshift barricade, every nerve on heightened alert. His mind raced through strategies, escape routes, fallback points, ways to hold until reinforcements arrived. But deep down, he knew the truth. Time was slipping away like sand through fingers. Outside, the air was thick with the roar of approaching tanks and the shouts of SS troops surrounding the castle. The German soldiers, once enemies, lined the walls, exchanging tense glances that spoke volumes. They might be fighting a common foe, but their hearts remained torn. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the fragile quiet. The assault had begun. Explosions rocked the fortress walls. Flamethrowers and grenades lit up the darkened skies like unnatural fireworks. Men yelled orders, some praying, others simply firing wildly into the chaos. Every second brought a new nightmare, a soldier lost, a wall breached, a life forever changed. Amidst the chaos, Major Joseph Gangl, wounded but determined, led a desperate counterattack. His voice rang out over the cacophony, rallying the Wehrmacht soldiers and American fighters alike. "Hold the line! For our honor! Stand firm!" In these critical moments, tragedy struck. Several men fell, heroes etched into history by their sacrifices. Jack watched a young soldier, barely 20, take a lethal hit while trying to shield a prisoner. The raw pain of loss cut deep, fueling his resolve for what was yet to come. As the enemy pressed forward, the defenders fought tooth and nail. Every bullet, every bloody hand-to-hand encounter was a testament to their unyielding spirit. The walls, once a symbol of eternity, trembled under the weight of war's brutality. The sun's rays streamed weakly through cracks and holes, casting fleeting shadows of hope amid despair. Suddenly, an explosion inside the fortress sent a shockwave through the courtyard. The SS troops had succeeded in breaching part of the defenses. The defenders retreated to the inner sanctum, where the final stand would unfold, one last defiance against annihilation. In this moment of despair, something unexpected emerged. A small group of prisoners, infused with newfound courage, took up rifles and charged into the fray, an act that would tip the balance and ignite a sliver of hope. For the first time, the defenders sensed that, despite everything, victory might still be possible. Nightfall loomed, and with it, the undeniable truth. This battle for the castle, for every soul inside, was reaching its crescendo. They fought not just for survival, but for their very humanity amidst the chaos, a story that would echo through history forever. Night had fallen over Castle Itter, but within the ancient stone bastions, a different kind of battle raged, one as much against fear and doubt as it was against the invading SS forces. The survivors huddled in small groups, tending to wounds, keeping watch, and sharing hushed stories that mixed memories of better days with the looming specter of the fight yet to come. Captain Jack Lee paced the dimly lit corridors, his mind heavy with the weight of command and the relentless questions that no one dared to voice aloud. How long could they hold? Would reinforcements arrive in time? Most painfully, how many of these men, Germans, Americans, and prisoners alike, would make it through the next storm? The castle, once a symbol of power and security, now felt both refuge and cage. It echoed with the sounds of whispered prayers, shuffling feet, and the distant rumble of enemy movements beyond the walls. Within these halls, skeptics grappled with doubt, loyalists clung to hope, and the lines between friend and foe had crystallized into something more profound, a fragile brotherhood forged in fire. Major Joseph Gangl gathered his soldiers in a small chamber, his presence a steady beacon amid chaos. He showed cracks in his armor, his fatigue, his grief over lost comrades, but also an unyielding resolve. He shared stories of the Wehrmacht before ideology darkened their path, reminding his men of the honor still possible in these final hours. Elsewhere, the French prisoners moved among the defenders, some still daunted by their sudden role as fighters, others rising to the challenge. The former tennis champion, whose name was whispered in both fear and admiration, checked weapons and offered what encouragement he could, transforming from victim to reluctant protector. Unexpected moments of warmth flickered amid the cold stone walls. A soldier shared a cigarette with a prisoner. Children's laughter, muffled and fleeting, echoed faintly through hidden chambers. These glimpses of humanity, fragile, fleeting, sustained them amidst the horrors pressing ever closer. Yet, beyond these walls, the SS prepared their next move. Reconnaissance patrols prowled the night, seeking weaknesses, while commanders strategized the final crushing blow. The defenders knew the storm was approaching, dark, terrible, and merciless. Jack visited the wounded, offering words that steadied more than painkillers. Each man's story intertwined with the others, a patchwork of loss, courage, regret, and hope. The castle had become a crucible, burning away differences and leaving raw, undeniable truth. In war, humanity is both weapon and shield. As the night deepened, the defenders took turns at their posts, eyes scanning the shadowed horizon where the enemy's firelight flickered like ghostly fingers. Inside, uncertain but unbroken, they readied themselves for the next day, the day that would seal their legacy. As dawn crept hesitantly over the horizon on May 6th, the defenders of Castle Itter braced for a renewed assault, but there was one desperate mission that held their fragile hope, a task that could change everything. Among the French prisoners was Charles de Bonneval, a former tennis champion turned wartime hero whose courage had quietly grown amid captivity. Recognizing the gravity of their situation and the thin thread of salvation that lay beyond the castle walls, he volunteered for the most dangerous mission of all, to slip through enemy lines and seek reinforcements. Dressed in civilian clothes to avoid immediate suspicion, Charles slipped quietly into the pre-dawn shadows, armed only with a pistol and resolve forged from months of fear and resilience. Every step away from the castle felt like leaving a part of himself behind, yet he knew failure meant doom for all. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense forests, slick with morning dew, jagged rocks and narrow paths easily ambushed. The enemy patrolled relentlessly, their gaze sharp, ears tuned for any hint of movement. Charles moved cautiously, blending with the landscape, relying on instincts sharpened by both athleticism and wartime evasion. At every turn, danger loomed. A sudden rustle in the underbrush, a pair of boots echoing a few strides behind, the flash of a sniper's scope. Charles narrowly escaped capture more than once, diving into briar thickets and biting cold streams to hide from hunters seeking to end his perilous journey. Despite the physical toll, bruises, cuts, fatigue, he pressed on, driven by the flickering hope that reinforcements were not a myth. Memories of the companions he left behind, their faces etched with fear and unwavering faith, fueled his steps. In a rare moment of quiet, Charles paused atop a ridge, overlooking fields dotted with enemy vehicles and soldiers, the war's final act unfolding around him. His breath fogged in the cold air as he steeled himself for the approach to the American lines. Breaking through enemy territory was only the beginning. Once inside, Charles had to convince commanders of the urgency and authenticity of his message, a task complicated by skepticism bred of war's endless betrayals. The fate of Castle Itter now rested on his shoulders, the solitary messenger in the dark, racing against time to hold back an advancing nightmare. The sun had barely risen on May 7th when the defenders of Castle Itter faced the darkest hour of their ordeal. Exhaustion, hunger, and loss weighed heavily on every man, yet there was no room for despair. They were about to face the fiercest assault the SS could muster. The castle's battlements, battered but not broken, were manned by the few remaining Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers, their rifles emptying the last rounds into the swirling mass of attackers. The defenders' faces were etched with grim determination. Some bore scars old and new, others hid fear beneath a mask of resolve. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder. The acrid scent of burning wood mingled with cries of pain and defiance. Captain Jack Lee stood shoulder to shoulder with Major Joseph Gangel, their bond forged through unimaginable trials. Gangel was bleeding from a wound sustained the night before, yet his voice remained steady as he directed the last lines of defense. His sacrifice had already become a symbol among the defenders, a beacon of courage. The attackers were relentless. The SS, desperate to crush the castle's resistance before dawn, pressed harder than ever. Their strategy was brutal. Flamethrowers licked at wooden doors, grenades shattered walls, and fanatical troops stormed the breaches. Every inch of ground was fiercely contested. Inside, the castle's echoing hallways became tragic theaters of close-quarters combat. Men grappled in darkness, bayonets flashed, and the cries of the fallen became a haunting chorus. Amidst the chaos, the French prisoners, once politicians and aristocrats, fought bravely, their desperation igniting newfound strength. Captain Lee directed his men with calm urgency, rallying them again and again as they ran low on ammunition. The once bright hope dimmed with every loss, each casualty a painful reminder of mortality. But even as shadows stretched long and fatigue threatened to shatter spirits, the defenders refused to yield. It was here, in these crucible moments, that bonds became unbreakable, transcending nationality and past enmities. They fought not for flags or ideology, but for each other, humanity in the face of oblivion. Then, tragedy struck the heart of the defense. Major Gangel, while covering the retreat of the wounded, was hit. Blood soaked the ancient stones as he fell, a warrior's last stand. His death was mourned in silence, but celebrated as the ultimate sacrifice. The defenders retreated into the inner keep, their last bastion. With ammunition nearly exhausted, Jack Lee prepared for the inevitable, a deadly hand-to-hand confrontation where every bullet lost to silence would be replaced by blade and blood. Just as the SS forces surged forward for the final push, a new sound pierced the night, the rumble of approaching tanks and the sharp crackle of machine guns. Reinforcements led by the French tennis champion, who had braved enemy territory, arrived as a thunderous whirlwind, cutting through the enemy lines. The SS, surprised and demoralized, faltered. The beleaguered defenders seized the moment, pushing back with renewed fury. The tide turned as the battle reached its climax. As dawn broke fully, the ragged defenders stood victorious. The castle was battered, the cost immense, but the unlikely alliance had endured. This last hour, filled with loss, courage, and miracles, would forever be etched in the annals of history as the moment when fear was conquered by hope and enemies became brothers. As the first light of May 7th crept over the horizon, hope finally broke through the darkness that had enveloped Castle Itter for so long. The ragged, exhausted defenders stared toward the east, eyes sharp for a miracle, and at last it arrived. The distant roar of engines echoed through the valley. Like a thunderclap of salvation, a column of American tanks and infantry burst through the enemy lines, cutting a path through the SS forces who had tightened their grip around the castle. Leading the charge was none other than the former French tennis champion, now a fearless war hero whose daring escape had brought reinforcements just in time. The defenders within the castle rallied with renewed vigor. Gunfire intensified as the attackers' morale shattered facing fresh troops. The surprise arrival flipped the dynamics of the battle, turning desperation into fierce counterattack. Captain Jack Lee and Major Joseph Gangel's surviving men fought alongside the relief force in a brutal, chaotic sweep that scattered the remaining SS troops. The siege, which had seemed certain to end in tragedy not hours before, transformed into a stunning victory. Amid the smoke and shattered stones, weary soldiers embraced, some silently, some with tears, united not by politics or armies, but by shared survival and newfound brotherhood. The prisoners were freed, their faces a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The battle was over, but its scars would forever mark their souls. As the sun rose higher, announcing victory over darkness and tyranny, the defenders looked out from the battered ramparts at a world forever changed, a world where impossible alliances held firm and where courage was the greatest weapon of all. The sun had fully risen on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. the official end of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. But for those who survived the extraordinary siege of Castle Itter, the victory was bittersweet, etched forever in memory with both relief and sorrow. In the quiet aftermath, Captain Jack Lee stood among the battered walls, now scarred by gunfire and flame, reflecting on the cost of what had transpired. Out of nearly 50 defenders and prisoners who had fought side by side, barely half remained. The names of those lost, among them Major Joseph Gangl, whose sacrifice had been immortalized in whispered reverence, hung heavy in the air like a solemn prayer. The unusual alliance forged in those desperate days between Americans, Germans, and French prisoners defied the easy narratives of war. It was a story of shared humanity where enemies became comrades and survival required putting aside all that divided them. For many, this unlikely brotherhood would shape the rest of their lives, a testament to the power of courage and trust amid chaos. The liberated prisoners, once symbols of a nation's struggle and sovereignty, now carried not only their freedom, but the burden of honor, awed by the courage of their rescuer and captors alike. Their voices, once silenced by captivity, now spoke of hope, remembrance, and the complexity of wartime loyalty. Over the coming years, the siege of Castle Itter would become a powerful yet little-known chapter of history, a poignant example of how even in the darkest hours, the human spirit could find light through bravery and unity. Veterans recounted tales of fear and friendship, sacrifice and survival, ensuring that future generations understood the true price of freedom. Monuments were eventually raised, and the story became an emblem of reconciliation, reminding the world that war does not only breed hatred, but sometimes unites unlikely souls in the fight for what is right. Captain Lee, forever marked by those days, found solace knowing that their stand had saved lives and rewritten history. And in the twilight years of his life, when war's shadows began to fade, he carried with him the memory of Castle Itter, a castle not just of stone, but of enduring courage, humanity, and hope. Their names may fade from newsreels and textbooks, but the spirit born in that castle's last stand remains, an eternal flame that history will never extinguish.